year is 1945. The city is Cologne. The date is March 6th. And in the turret of a German Panther tank parked in the rubble near one of Europe's great cathedrals, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth is making the last military decision of his career. He has survived the fall of France. He has survived the retreat through Belgium. He has destroyed more American tanks than he can count from memory. He is not a frightened conscript. He is an experienced officer who knows, with the bone-deep certainty of 3 years of combat, exactly what American armor looks like and exactly what it is worth. So when an unfamiliar silhouette rounds the corner, a low, heavy hull with a gun barrel that is somehow too long, too heavy, wrong, he pauses. That is not a Sherman. The profile is off. The suspension looks different. Maybe it is one of ours. He tells his gunner, hold fire. 300 meters away, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, 21 years old, from the coal mining town of Lehighton, Pennsylvania, has already locked the Panther's turret ring in his gun sight. His hands are steady. He has a credo he has lived by since Normandy. Shoot fast and straight so you get the shot in before they shoot at you. He fires. His loader, Corporal John DeRiggy, slams another round into the breech. He fires again. A third round follows. 45 seconds from first shot to fire. That is how long the engagement lasted, according to Stars and Stripes. The Panther caught fire. Bartelborth and several of his crew bailed out through machine gun fire. One crewman did not escape the flames. An Army Signal Corps cameraman named Sergeant Jim Bates filmed every second of it from a window 2 floors above the street. That footage would be screened in theaters across the United States within weeks. Audiences who had spent 3 years watching newsreels of Sherman crews climbing out of burning tanks watched something different. A German Panther, the feared, the legendary, the supposedly invincible, turned into a smoking wreck in under a minute by an American tank that almost no one knew existed. But here is what those newsreels did not tell you. That moment in Cologne was not just a tank duel. It was a bill coming due. A bill that had been building for 3 years, built from institutional arrogance, from a doctrine authored by a general who had never driven a tank in combat, and from a catastrophically wrong assumption shared by German commanders, and shamefully by American ones, that the United States of America was not capable of building a serious, heavy tank. This is not a story about a 90mm gun. This is a forensic audit of how one of the most powerful armored forces in modern history looked at its enemy's weapon program, laughed at it, and paid for that laugh in burning Shermans and dead crew members, paid for it in hedgerows and snowfields and city streets across 3 years and 2 continents, while the answer sat on a drawing board in Washington waiting for one general to get out of the way. The verdict, 20 tanks, 45 seconds, the death of a myth. To understand why Bartelborth hesitated and why that hesitation cost him, we need to go back to where the laugh started. Not to 1944, not to D-Day, all the way back to 1942. Because that is when both sides made their choices, and one side made the wrong one. Part 1. The comfortable lie. Let's start with a number, not a production figure, not a range table, an emotional fact. By the summer of 1944, American tank crews were dying in the hedgerows of Normandy at a rate that their commanders struggled to put into words. Bill Harris, a tank gunner with the 2nd Armored Division, later described what his officers had told him before the invasion. We'd been assured by our officers before we invaded France in 1944 that our Sherman tanks could take care of any Nazi armor we met there. That assurance was false, and Harris knew it within the first week of combat. He would have 3 Shermans shot out from under him before the war was over. Think about what that means. 3 times, Harris climbed into a tank that he had been told was adequate. 3 times, the mathematics of Panther and Tiger guns proved otherwise. 3 times, he survived the fire and started over. Here is what the mathematics actually looked like. The standard Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges of approximately 100 to 200 meters. In other words, you had to be dangerously close before your gun could threaten the tank threatening you. Meanwhile, a Tiger's 88mm gun could pierce a Sherman's frontal armor at ranges approaching 1,500 meters under good conditions. The Panther's 75mm high-velocity gun was almost as lethal at comparable distances. Absorb that disparity for a moment. In ideal conditions, a Tiger could kill a Sherman from nearly a mile away. The Sherman crew had to close to effective pistol shot range before their gun became seriously dangerous to a Tiger. This was not a tactical problem. This was a physics problem. And no amount of tactical ingenuity solved physics. The Allies called it many things in official reports. In the letters that tank crews wrote home, the letters that got past the censors and the letters that did not, they called it something else. German crews had their own names for the Sherman. Tommy Cooker, Ronson Lighter. The reference was to the Ronson cigarette lighter brand, whose advertising slogan was, "Lights first time, every time." American tanks burned. Everyone knew this. It was documented, it was consistent, and it was earned. So when German tank crews laughed at American armor, and they did laugh, this appears throughout post-war memoirs and wartime interrogation reports, they were not being irrational. The Panther and Tiger were genuinely superior to the Sherman in frontal armor and gun range. German crews were accurate in their assessment, and that accuracy bred something more dangerous than arrogance. It bred certainty, a certainty that became doctrine. For 3 years, German armored units operated with a structural, psychological advantage, the absolute conviction that their equipment was better. That conviction was the difference between a crew that holds a position and a crew that breaks. It kept men fighting through retreats, fuel shortages, and air attacks that would have broken armies with lesser morale, and it was built, brick by brick, on an assessment of American capabilities that was, for a specific window of time, factually correct. Keep that word in mind. Window. Because in 1942, American engineers began building something that would close that window. They just needed someone to let them build it. That someone did not cooperate. General Leslie J. McNair was the commander of the United States Army Ground Forces from 1942 until his death in 1944. He was the man responsible for deciding what equipment the American infantry and armor would carry into battle. He was a former artilleryman, a systematic thinker, a believer in doctrine, and his doctrine was this: tanks do not fight tanks. Tanks exploit breakthroughs and support infantry. When you encounter enemy armor, you call the tank destroyers, the M10, the M18 Hellcat, the fast, lightly armored vehicles with powerful anti-tank guns that are specifically designed for that job. Under this doctrine, building a heavy tank with thick armor and a big anti-tank gun was a categorical error. It confused the tank's purpose. It was logistically burdensome. Heavier vehicles meant more strain on the supply chain, on bridges, on shipping across the Atlantic. It was unnecessary. The M4 Sherman, McNair's office repeatedly determined, was adequate for the role it was designed for. In September 1943, the Ordnance Department formally requested production of 500 T-26 tanks, the experimental heavy tank with a 90mm gun that engineers had been developing since 1942. The request went to McNair's office. McNair successfully opposed it. The request was denied. In November 1943, General Jacob Devers, commanding U.S. forces in the European theater, went further. He requested 250 T-26 for the upcoming invasion of France. He had seen what German armor was doing to Shermans in Italy. He had read the reports. He wanted the answer on the battlefield before D-Day. McNair's office pushed back. Devers escalated to the War Department. In December 1943, Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall overruled McNair and authorized production of 250 units, but the authorization came too late. Manufacturing did not begin until November 1944, and when the tanks finally reached Europe in January 1945, they numbered not 250, but 20 tanks, after 3 years and 1,000 burning Shermans. Here is the irony that history sometimes buries, and you deserve to know it. General Leslie McNair was killed on July 25, 1944, in a field in Normandy. He died during Operation Cobra, the American breakout operation, killed by bombs dropped by American aircraft that accidentally hit his position. The man most responsible for keeping the Pershing off the battlefield died in the same battlefield environment his doctrine had failed to address, killed by friendly fire. By then, American engineers had been working on the answer for 2 years. By then, Eisenhower had urgently requested heavy tanks, after the Normandy fighting revealed the full scale of the Sherman's inadequacy. By then, thousands of American tankers had already paid the price for McNair's certitude. And in factories in Michigan and Pennsylvania, the answer was taking shape, quietly, in secret, under a level of security that even the workers on the assembly line did not fully understand. They were being told they were building a new Sherman variant. Remember that phrase. It will come back in a way that changes everything. Part 2. The Secret in the Crates. In the fall of 1944, 20 crates were loaded onto ships in American ports. The crates were abnormally large. They were stenciled with mundane shipping codes. The men escorting them were under instructions. If anyone asks, you are transporting new Sherman variants. Inside each crate was a machine that no German soldier had ever seen, that no German intelligence file described, and that appeared on no recognition chart in any Panzerwaffe training school, the T-26E3, 46 tons, a torsion bar suspension system designed for reliability across European terrain, a Ford GAAV-8 engine producing 500 horsepower, the same power plant used in the late Shermans, now pulling 10 additional tons of steel, a wide, low-slung cast turret that sat distinctively different from anything the Germans had catalogued, and mounted in that turret a 90mm M3 gun that fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at over 2,800 feet per second. The specifications mattered. On paper, and paper was where the engineers had been arguing for 2 years, the M82 armor-piercing round could punch through approximately 150 millimeters of rolled steel armor at 500 meters. The HVAP round, with its tungsten carbide core, could exceed 250 millimeters at that range. To give that a frame of reference, the Tiger I's frontal turret armor was 100 millimeters. The King Tiger's glacis was 150 millimeters. Under the right conditions, with the right ammunition, the Pershing's gun could threaten anything Germany had fielded. The design had been in development since 1942, emerging from a line of experimental vehicles, the T-20, the T-23, the T-25, that the Army's Ordnance Department had been refining through the years that McNair's office spent blocking them from production. The engineers who built it knew what they had. General Maurice Rose, the Denver-born commander of the 3rd Armored Division, one of the most decorated armored commanders in the American Army, personally came out to watch a demonstration at Stolberg, Germany, in late February 1945. Clarence Smoyer was the gunner chosen for that demonstration, 21 years old, from Pennsylvania coal country. He had joined the Army in February 1943 at age 19. He was, by any measure, an exceptional shot, accurate, calm, technical in his understanding of the gun. General Rose and a group of senior officers stood on a hilltop. Smoyer was in the Pershing turret. He put round after round through targets at distances that drew audible reactions from the officers watching. Rose turned to his staff afterward and said that American gunnery was far superior to anything the Germans had. After the demonstration, Smoyer climbed out of the tank and told the other tankers, "The Army needs to rush a whole bunch of these over here." He was right. They had 20. The mission bringing those 20 tanks to the Western Front was called Operation Zebra. It was led personally by Major General Gladian M. Barnes, chief of the Research and Development section of Army Ordnance, a man who had fought for the Pershing's development for years and was not going to let it reach combat without being there himself. Barnes flew to Europe, embedded with the units, and ensured the tanks were properly distributed and supported. The 20 vehicles arrived at the Belgian port of Antwerp in late January 1945. 10 went to the 3rd Armored Division, 10 to the 9th Armored Division, both operating under the 1st Army, both pressing toward the Rhine. The plan was precise and deliberate. Distribute the Pershings, one per company, dissolving them into formations of Shermans. Keep them hidden in plain sight. Preserve the secret. The crews were given standing orders that amounted to an extraordinary operational restriction. Avoid combat unless specifically engaging German heavy tanks. The Pershing was not to be wasted. It was not to be risked on infantry or soft targets or anything less than the tanks it had been designed to kill. The goal was to save the shock effect, to preserve the element of surprise for the engagement that would matter. Smoyer's crew had been together since September 1944. They had arrived in France weeks after D-Day and had fought through the worst of the Normandy campaign in a Sherman. They had developed the bleak survival mathematics that all experienced tank crews learned. The lead tank always gets hit first. They had watched friends die in vehicles that could not protect them. When they transferred to the Pershing, they understood immediately what it meant, and they understood its cost. Having the biggest tank, the biggest gun meant one thing: they would always be in front. The biggest tank, biggest gun, that is where it belongs, at the front, Smoyer said later. But it gets very nerve-wracking. On February 25, 1945, the Pershing drew blood for the first time. A 3rd Armored Division crew near the Roer River engaged German positions. The engagement was noted, the secret held, barely. The next day, near the German town of Elsdorf, a Pershing nicknamed Fireball drove into an ambush. A concealed Tiger fired from close range. The 88mm round struck the Pershing's gun mantlet. The tank was severely damaged. German observers at the engagement saw something register as wrong about the vehicle. The silhouette was not a Sherman. The gun was too long. But before they could process what they were seeing, American recovery teams arrived, loaded the Fireball onto a transporter, and drove it away. The Fireball was back in action by early March. Think about what that meant to any German soldier watching. American tanks did not do that. A hit American tank stayed in the field. It burned. You counted it as a kill and moved on. The concept of a damaged American tank being recovered, repaired, and returned to combat within days was outside the established pattern of everything they had seen for 3 years. It was a small thing, but small things accumulate. German reports from the Roer sector and around Elsdorf were starting to describe something anomalous. American tanks with unusual silhouettes, gun profiles that did not match the Sherman variants they had catalogued, engagement results that did not follow the expected pattern. These reports moved up through the chain of command and were, in the main, dismissed. After all, the Americans built quantity, not quality. The training manuals said so. 3 years of combat had confirmed it. Whatever the crews in the field thought they were seeing, it was probably misidentification in the smoke and confusion. But the reports kept coming. And somewhere in the German command structure, someone was beginning to understand that dismissing them might be the most expensive mistake they had made since deciding to invade France. They just had not had the moment yet. The moment that would make dismissal impossible. That moment was 9 days away. Men like Corporal Smoyer did not cross the Atlantic looking for glory. They crossed it because someone had to, and they had been asked. Every like on this video keeps their story in the record. It is a small thing, but small things accumulate, and that matters. Part 3. Cologne. Let me tell you what the city looked like. Cologne had been bombed 262 times by the time American forces reached its outskirts. It had once been the 3rd largest city in Germany, a center of commerce and culture on the Rhine, a place where the Roman Empire had established a garrison 2,000 years before. By March 1945, it was architecture and fire damage. Blocks of rubble where streets had been, facades of buildings standing without floors behind them, a city that looked from the air like a model that someone had stepped on. But the Cologne Cathedral still stood. Its twin Gothic spires, construction on them had begun in 1248 and was not completed until 1880, had survived everything the 20th century threw at them. Allied bombers had been under standing orders not to destroy it, partly for its cultural and religious significance, partly because it served as a navigation landmark for Allied aircraft. It had been struck by bombs, damaged but not destroyed. It stood over the ruins of the city like something that refused to accept that the world around it had ended. On the morning of March 5, 1945, the 3rd Armored Division entered Cologne from 3 directions. Over the radio, Smoyer heard the voice of his company commander. "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let us knock the hell out of it." The German defense was limited. Most Wehrmacht forces had already crossed the Rhine and destroyed the Hohenzollern Bridge behind them, the last bridge linking the city's east and west banks. But a handful of tanks remained on the western bank, ordered by command to hold to the last round. Among them was the Panther of Panzer Brigade, 106 Feldherrenhalle, commanded by Lieutenant Wilhelm Bartelborth. The German defenders were using what the Americans had started calling mouse trails, underground tunnels and basement connections that allowed soldiers to move from building to building without exposing themselves to fire above ground. It made the urban fighting unpredictable. You could clear a block and find enemies behind you minutes later. Smoyer knew this. Every crew entering Cologne knew this. The city was not safe until it was empty, and it was not going to be empty today. On the morning of March 6th, Bartelborth positioned his Panther near the cathedral, using rubble from bombed-out buildings as partial hull cover, his gun covering the approaches from multiple directions. He was an experienced commander in a powerful tank, in a position of his choosing. He had clear fields of fire. If American armor came down any of the covered streets, he would see it first and fire first. In theory, this was an excellent position. 2 M4 Shermans, supporting American infantry, came up the street the Panther was covering. They did not see it until it was too late. The Panther fired twice. 2 75mm rounds struck the lead Sherman's turret. 3 of the 5 crew were killed. The second Sherman, its tracks damaged, was disabled. The survivors radioed back. That radio call reached Eagle 7. Sergeant Robert Early, the commander of Eagle 7, explained the situation to his crew. There was a Panther near the cathedral. It had already destroyed 1 Sherman and disabled another. 3 American soldiers were dead. The Panther's gun was oriented down the street where it had just fired. If Eagle 7 could come up the adjacent street and enter the intersection from the flank, it might catch the Panther with its gun still facing the wrong way. Might. In the rubble of a bombed-out German city, against a Panther crew that had just demonstrated it knew how to fight, with no room to maneuver and nowhere to retreat if things went wrong. Author Adam Makos, who later documented this crew in detail, described the assignment as a suicide mission. Early's crew volunteered. The Pershing moved up the adjacent street. Driver William McVeigh had his periscope turned sideways, watching the cross street where the Panther waited. Smoyer began rotating the turret. Loader DeRiggi prepared the first round. Bowgunner Homer Davis sat in the hull, watching his own sector. Early stood in the commander's position, directing. As Eagle 7 edged into the intersection, McVeigh saw through his periscope that the Panther's gun was beginning to traverse. Bartelborth had heard them coming. He was reorienting. McVeigh did not stop. He gunned the engine, pushing the Pershing out into the open, trying to make the tank a moving target rather than a stationary one sitting in the entrance to the intersection. Smoyer completed his rotation. He saw the Panther, close, maybe 300 meters, muzzle pointed almost directly at him. Bartelborth did not fire. Later reconstruction of the engagement, drawing on survivor accounts, suggests that Bartelborth hesitated because he'd never seen a Pershing before. In the smoke and rubble, the profile was wrong. The gun was wrong. The hull shape was wrong. The suspension was wrong. Everything about this vehicle violated the visual library he had been building for 3 years of fighting Americans. Some accounts suggest he believed for a critical few seconds that it might be a German tank. He told his gunner to hold. Smoyer had no such uncertainty. He saw the Panther's gun pointed at him. He fired. The first 90mm round struck the Panther below the gun shield. The impact rocked the tank. Smoyer did not wait to see the effect. He called for reload. DeRiggi slammed another round into the breech. Second shot. The Panther's side armor. Third shot. Through and through. All 3 rounds penetrated. The last 2, Smoyer later learned, had gone through the Panther's armor on one side and out the other. 45 seconds. Bartelborth and several crew members bailed out of the burning tank into machine gun fire from American infantry that had crept forward with Eagle 7. They survived. 1 crewman, deeper in the turret, could not escape before the ammunition began cooking off. He died in the tank. The Panther would burn for several days in the square in front of the cathedral. Jim Bates was in the window 2 floors above the street. His camera captured everything, each impact, each crew member escaping, the fire rising, the cathedral spires visible above the smoke. He came down afterward and filmed the Eagle 7 crew climbing out of the Pershing in the street below. Early, Smoyer, DeRiggi, McVeigh, Davis, 5 men who had just done something that 3 years of American tank doctrine had said was impossible. They drove the tank forward toward the Rhine. The battle was not over. That footage reached American theaters within weeks. Audiences who had seen Sherman Burns as the background noise of the war in Europe watched a German Panther become a wreck in under a minute. The psychological impact on the home front was considerable, but that was not the most important reaction to the Cologne engagement. The most important reaction happened in German command posts. Reports came in from Bartelborth's unit that evening. An American tank, unknown type, gun in the 90mm class, frontal armor that had not yielded to return fire, a profile that matched nothing in their reference materials. The command sent urgent messages to all frontline units. Report any encounters with new American heavy tanks immediately. Provide detailed descriptions. Forward all information without delay. The responses that came back over the following days described the same thing from different sectors, different units, different engagements. Guns that penetrated German heavy armor from the front. Profiles that did not match the Sherman. Something that broke the pattern. In Panzerwaffe training schools, officers pulled out the recognition charts. The Pershing was not on them. The tactical manuals assumed American tank guns could not penetrate German heavy armor frontally. That assumption was no longer true, and the crews in the field had known it was wrong for days before the manuals caught up. But the most significant consequence of Cologne was not in a command post or a training school. It was in a German soldier named Gustav Schäfer. Schäfer was a crew member aboard Bartelborth's Panther who survived the engagement and eventually surrendered to American forces. After the war, decades after, he tracked down Clarence Smoyer. In 2013, the 2 men met in Cologne. They stood together at the intersection where it had happened. They walked to the spot where the Panther had burned. Remember that detail? We are coming back to it. Because what happened after Cologne, what happened when 20 tanks worth of reports accumulated into a picture that German command could no longer dismiss, that is the part of this story that gets written off as a footnote. And it should not be. Part 4. The arithmetic of endings. Here is the number that tells the story. Sit with it. By October 1945, American factories had produced 2,212 Pershing tanks, not across the entire war. In less than 1 year of production, from November 1944 to October 1945, Fisher Body's Grand Blanc plant in Michigan alone turned out approximately 1,190 units. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler, produced 246 more by June 1945. These were not small operations. These were car factories, the same facilities that had been building Chevrolets before the war, retooled, reoriented, and producing heavy tanks on an industrial scale that had no precedent in the history of armored warfare. Now place that against Germany. Total German production of Tiger I heavy tanks during the entire war, approximately 1,347 vehicles. Total King Tigers, 492. Add them together, roughly 1,839 heavy tanks across 4 years of full war mobilization. American industry, in less than 1 year of Pershing production, nearly matched Germany's entire heavy tank output across the whole war. And this happened while American factories were simultaneously producing M4 Shermans by the tens of thousands, while American shipyards were launching destroyers and carriers, while American aircraft plants were turning out P-51s and B-29s. The Pershing was a side note in the largest industrial mobilization in human history. German tank crews knew about American production capacity in the abstract, captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and years of watching American supply columns that never seemed to run empty had given them a working understanding of the disparity. What they did not know, what they could not have known, because German intelligence had essentially no information on the T-26 program, was that the United States had spent 3 years building a qualitative answer to the Tiger, not just quantitative ones. The intelligence failure on the German side was complete. Recognition charts distributed to German armor units in early 1945 contained no depiction of the Pershing. Tactical manuals continued to instruct crews that American tank guns could not penetrate German heavy armor from the front. Training schools had nothing to distribute when commanders asked for information on the new American vehicle. The assumption that America would continue building Shermans in bulk, that the industrial democracy across the Atlantic was structurally incapable of producing technically sophisticated weapons, had calcified into doctrine. And doctrine, once established, resists the evidence of individual combat reports. After Cologne, German units in multiple sectors reported engagements with unidentified American heavy tanks, guns in the 90mm class, frontal armor that deflected Panther rounds at combat ranges. The pattern was consistent across different divisions, different fronts, different days. It was not misidentification. It was not panic. It was accurate observation of a new reality. But German headquarters were processing these reports while simultaneously managing the general collapse of the Western Front. Allied bridgeheads across the Rhine, fuel shortages so severe that tanks were being towed to combat positions, air attacks that made daylight movement suicidal. In that environment, even accurate information got lost in the noise. Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik provides a ground-level view of what this looked like from the American side. Commanding a Pershing with the 3rd Armored Division, his tank designated number 40, Mashlonik had been fighting since Normandy. He had 15 tank kills since D-Day, 3 of them in the new Pershing. At Elsdorf, he had watched a Tiger try to back away from his 90mm gun, run into rubble, be abandoned by its crew, and sit immobilized in the field. After the engagement, he described what it felt like to no longer be the prey. The dynamic had inverted. The system had reversed. And here is where intellectual honesty requires a counter-argument, because this is the kind of detail that separates forensic audit from propaganda. The Pershing was not a perfect tank. Its transmission was notoriously unreliable. Breakdowns plagued the design throughout its service life in Europe and again in Korea 5 years later. The 90mm gun, while powerful, had a slower rate of fire than the German 88mm it was designed to counter. Its armor, well-sloped and effective, was thinner than the King Tigers in certain sections. Post-war assessments by historians, including R.P. Honeycutt, generally rank the Pershing below the Tiger II in overall specification, though ahead of the Tiger I and Panther. German veteran tankers who survived the war and wrote their memoirs were largely honest about this. When they described what had defeated them, the Pershing was mentioned as part of a longer list: Allied air superiority, artillery, fuel shortages, the destruction of the German supply system. Most did not describe the Pershing as the single decisive moment. They had been losing the war before the Pershing arrived. The Pershing arrived when they were already losing. But here is the distinction that makes the Cologne engagement significant beyond its tactical result. By early 1945, German tank crews had maintained their fighting spirit through 3 years of retreat by holding on to one structural certainty: their tanks were better. That belief was the psychological spine of an armored force that was outnumbered, undersupplied, and operating under constant aerial attack. It was the argument for fighting on. If the Tiger was superior, then perhaps quality could still compensate for quantity. Perhaps the war was not entirely lost. 20 Pershing tanks, distributed across the front in 1s and 2s, hiding among Shermans, encountering German armor in engagements where their 90mm guns performed as designed. Those 20 tanks cut the argument at the root. German commanders could no longer assume that any American tank approaching their position was a Sherman they could engage on favorable terms. Every contact became a calculation with an unknown variable. Was that a Sherman, or was it a Pershing that would punch through their frontal armor at battle range? There was no way to know until the shooting started. And by the time the shooting started, it might already be over. That uncertainty, not the mechanical specifications of the gun, not the thickness of the armor, was what the Pershing actually brought to the Western Front. On March 7, 1945, the day after Cologne, a platoon of Pershings from the 9th Armored Division played a key role in supporting the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the only bridge across the Rhine that remained intact, seized in an operation that shattered German plans for a coherent defense on the eastern bank. The Rhine crossing that German strategy had counted on holding indefinitely was breached within 24 hours of the Cologne duel. 3 weeks later, General Maurice Rose, the man who had watched Smoyer's demonstration at Stolberg, who had said American gunnery was superior to anything Germany had, drove into a German tank ambush near Paderborn. Rose was killed. He became the highest-ranking American field commander to die in the European theater. The 3rd Armored Division he had commanded drove on. If your father or grandfather served in that war, if he drove a tank, repaired one, or served alongside the men who did, I would be honored to hear his story in the comments. What unit? Where did he fight? Those details belong in the record. No official archive captures all of it, and a history that leaves out the individual is not history. It is just a timeline. Part 5. The verdict. What 20 tanks actually killed. We started with Clarence Smoyer. Let's finish there, because the full arc of his story is the audit made human. After Cologne, Smoyer and the Eagle 7 crew crossed the Rhine south of the city and advanced toward the Ruhr. They fought through April 1945. And when Germany surrendered in May, Smoyer went home to Lehighton, Pennsylvania, then settled in Allentown. He found work. He lived quietly. He said very little about the war. For decades, the Cologne engagement was known primarily through Jim Bates's film footage, screened in theaters, later shown on television, eventually distributed online. Millions of people watched that footage over the years without knowing the gunner's name. The tank and its kill became famous. The man who fired the gun remained unknown. He remained unknown by choice. Smoyer was haunted by something that happened during the same day as the cathedral duel, an incident that the Cologne film does not show, that Bates did not capture. Earlier that morning, Eagle 7 had been involved in a firefight with a German Panzer IV that had taken cover behind a building. Smoyer had fired into the building to try to flush it out. In the crossfire, 2 German civilians, a man and a woman, had been killed in their car. Smoyer did not know about the civilians for years. When he found out, it stayed with him. I spent many years wondering if they survived, he said of German crew members and civilians connected to the day's events. Only recently did he find the answer. In 2013, Smoyer traveled back to Cologne with author Adam Makos, who was researching the book that would become Spearhead. On that trip, Smoyer met Gustav Schaefer, a survivor of Bartelborth's Panther crew, who had escaped the burning tank and eventually surrendered to American forces. Think about what that meeting required from both men. A 21-year-old American gunner who had fired the shots that killed one of Schaefer's crewmates. A German soldier who had lived through a tank engagement that should have gone the other way. That could have been a different outcome in a different second. 2 old men standing in a Cologne street where a Panther had burned for several days in March 1945. On that trip, Smoyer and Schaefer walked together to the grave of Katharina Esser, the German civilian woman who had been killed in the crossfire earlier that day. They laid flowers. Schaefer said to Smoyer, through a translator, "In the next life, we will be comrades instead of enemies." Gustav Schaefer died in 2017. Clarence Smoyer was 92 years old. On September 18, 2019, at the National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., a 95-year-old man from Lehighton, Pennsylvania, stood at attention while an Army major pinned a bronze star to his lapel. The engagement that earned it had taken place 74 years earlier. 74 years. His 4 crewmates, Sergeant Robert Early, John DeRiggy, William McVeigh, Homer Davis, received their bronze stars posthumously. Their families accepted the medals on their behalf. Senator Pat Toomey attended the ceremony. Reporters from the Washington Post and other outlets covered it. Makos had arranged the whole thing, having brought the story to the Army's attention through the publication of Spearhead. Smoyer was asked to comment on receiving the medal. He said, "It is an honor. I will always honor that. I will do that in remembrance of all the young boys that were killed over there. Not glory, not vindication, not justice for a wrong finally righted. Remembrance." Now let's close the audit. The German Panzerwaffe laughed at American armor. That laugh was documented, understandable, and for a specific period, roughly 1942 through most of 1944, it was factually justified. The Sherman was outclassed by the Tiger and Panther in head-to-head armor engagements. American doctrine under McNair compounded the problem by delaying the weapon system that could answer German armor on equal terms. The delay cost lives that need not have been spent. Here is what the American tank force lost while McNair's doctrine held production hostage. From June 6, 1944, through the end of the war in Europe, American forces in the Western Theater lost somewhere between 4,295 and 4,399 M4 Sherman tanks, along with more than 1,000 other armored vehicles. These are not abstract figures. Each one of those tanks had 5 crew members. Most of those engagements were survivable. Not all were. When the Pershing finally arrived, 20 tanks, January 1945, hidden in shipping crates and called New Shermans to preserve the secret, it was arriving late to a tragedy it might have shortened by months if the institutional barriers had fallen a year earlier. Whether an earlier Pershing would have changed the course of the war is genuinely debated among historians, and that debate is unresolved. What is not debated is what the delay cost. But here is the verdict on what those 20 tanks accomplished that the casualty figures cannot capture. They did not win the war. The war was already decided by the long arithmetic of industrial mobilization, the aircraft factories and the shipyards and the fuel pipelines and the logistics networks that had been grinding Germany down since 1942. By early 1945, the German military was collapsing, not because of Pershing tanks, but because it was out of fuel, out of skilled personnel, cut off from raw materials, and fighting under conditions of Allied air superiority so complete that moving in daylight was an invitation to die. What those 20 tanks did was something more specific, and in the context of ending a war, potentially more important than adding to a kill count. They destroyed the last argument. German tank crews had maintained their fighting spirit through 3 years of retreat and loss by holding onto one certainty: their equipment was better. When that certainty cracked, when the reports from Cologne and Elsdorf and the Ruhr sector accumulated into a picture that German command could no longer dismiss, what broke was not just morale. What broke was the internal logic that had kept men feeding themselves into a losing battle on the theory that quality might still compensate for the impossible mathematics of Allied production. After the war, German veterans who wrote honestly about their defeat pointed to air power, artillery, fuel shortages, and the overwhelming weight of Allied logistics. They did not, in the main, describe the Pershing as a decisive moment, but several described something more diffuse: the growing understanding, in the final months of the war, that the enemy was not standing still, that the industrial democracy they had been taught to hold in contempt had spent 3 years of war building, testing, and improving, arriving at solutions to the problems that had made the Tiger and Panther dominant. The Pershing was evidence of that. Not the whole story, not the decisive weapon, but evidence of a system, American industrial democracy at full mobilization, that had matched German engineering excellence while simultaneously outproducing it by factors that made the comparison absurd. Germany built 1,347 Tiger, 1 tanks across 4 years of war. In less than 12 months, American factories produced 2,212 Pershings. While building everything else, while feeding and fueling and moving the largest military force in American history across 2 oceans. War is mathematics. The math was never close. But Clarence Smoyer did not fight a mathematical abstraction. He fought in a specific intersection, in a specific city, on a specific afternoon in March 1945. He aimed at a tank whose commander hesitated for a reason no one fully understood until years later. He fired 3 times in 45 seconds. He drove on toward the Rhine, and 68 years later he got on a plane and flew to Cologne with Adam Makos to lay flowers on a grave with a man who had been on the other side of those 3 shots. That is not in the tactical manuals. It is not in the production figures. It is not in the after-action reports or the intelligence assessments or the official histories. But it is the truest part of this audit, because the men who fight wars are not the myths we build around them. They are people who did something extraordinary under circumstances they did not choose, who lived with what they did long after the official record closed, and who, if given the opportunity, found that the line between enemy and fellow human being was thinner than the armor between their guns. Clarence Smoyer died on March 8, 2022 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was 97 years old. The Cologne Cathedral still stands. The myth did not survive the afternoon. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see the gap between what history claims happened and what the evidence actually shows, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about getting the record right, not just repeating the version that was written for ease of telling. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. Because the truth about how wars are won, in factories, in design bureaus, in the decisions of men sitting behind desks far from the front, is more complex and more human than any museum placard can say. These men had names. They deserve to be remembered by them, not by the myths that replaced them.